Order, order. John Lamont to move the motion.
Thank you, Margaret. It's a pleasure to serve with you in the chair. I beg to move that this House has considered E-petition 734311 relating to the public being given a right to a vote of no confidence. I want to start by thanking the more than 120,000 people across the United Kingdom who have signed this petition securing today's debate. I would also like to thank some of the organisations I've met during this process, including Unlock Democracy and their Chief Executive, a former member of this House, Tom Brake, alongside the Hansard Society and the Electoral Reform Society, who are universally recognised as independent and non-partisan authorities on this area. Now, whatever members' views on the proposal itself, the fact that so many people have taken the time to sign this petition demands that it is treated with seriousness and respect. This petition calls for the introduction of a mechanism that would allow the public to remove a government that no longer commands public support. The petitioner states that we voted for a party based on promises made before the general election, yet we feel none have been delivered. In fact, the opposite has happened. I could not have put it better myself. Whatever we have seen since the election from this Prime Minister is nothing but chaos. This government is making bad decisions. It is damaging our economy. It is crushing businesses. It is driving unemployment up. It is piling on debt. It is giving away sovereign territory. It is allowing our veterans to be dragged through the courts. That it's because the Prime Minister came to office with no plan for our country. There have now been at least 15 major U-turns from this Labour government, hiking taxes on working people despite promises before the election not to do so. Pensioners left freezing in their homes last winter because of the government's cruel cuts to winter fuel payments. The family farm tax, the refusal for so many months to hold a grooming gangs inquiry, welfare reforms scrapped, digital ID, waspy women left betrayed. The list goes on and on, Mrs Barker.
I wonder if you give way on that
I happily give way to my honourable friend.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and this is a really important issue, unquestionably, and it is indicative of the unhappiness of the public with this government in particular. But does he agree with me that one of the great difficulties with this government is the number of manifesto pledges that have been broken, things that have been introduced that weren't in the manifesto, and the constant U-turning would spin your head?
My honourable friend makes an excellent point. I think that goes to the nub of the motivation for this petition. It's not so much, I think, the desire for constitutional change. It's a desire and a feeling of feeling let down by this government. A government that promised change but has delivered none of the change, and all the promises they did make have been abandoned and have tried to bring forward other measures which were nowhere near their manifesto at the time of the election. Now, Mrs Barker, the Prime Minister promised the highest possible standards. In his own words, he said, a government of service. Yet all we have seen is scandal and chaos. Peter Mandelson appointed US Ambassador despite his links to a notorious paedophile. A comms chief appointed to the House of Lords despite his links to another paedophile. A Deputy Prime Minister caught evading tax. A homelessness minister who resigned after making her tenants homeless. And a Cabinet Office Minister just this weekend forced to quit after it was discovered he had hired a firm to gather information on journalists to discredit them. And there have been many others, too many to mention today. Now, the reason people are signing this petition is that they are fed up. Fed up with the chaos, fed up with the U-turns, and fed up with this Prime Minister. Now, I want to turn to the proposal put forward by the petitioners. Members of Parliament of whatever party serve at the pleasure of the British people. It is their right to elect us, and it is their right to remove us at an election too. There are many questions as to how the petitioner's proposal would work in practice. Would the proposal mean a new general election with the public going back to the polls? Or could it mean the formation of a new government and a new Prime Minister from within the current House of Commons? There's also the significant question of the defined and national threshold. It would be easy for a well-organised, well-funded campaign group to remove a government of any political party should the threshold be set too low. Would the threshold of 10% of the British public, the same threshold as for recall petitions for members of Parliament today? Or should it perhaps be 50% or perhaps a higher percentage than the incumbent government secured at the last general election. Whatever that number, it would have to be high enough to demonstrate a genuine national consensus. Over what period would the signatures need to be gathered, and how would they be verified to ensure democratic legitimacy and prevent foreign state actors from interfering politically? There is also the question of frequency. If a petition succeeded once, could another one be launched shortly thereafter? There are also important questions that would need to be answered for such a profound constitutional change. However, none of these practical concerns should blind us to the message being sent by the people who signed this petition. Mrs Barker, less than 2 months ago, I moved a debate in this chamber, again on behalf of the Petitions Committee, after more than 3 million people signed a petition calling for a general election. People are deeply angry about the performance of this government. They feel unheard. They are sick and tired of the constant mistakes being made by the Prime Minister and his ministers almost every day. Rather than Labour MPs focusing on making our country better, it seems their energies are being consumed by leadership speculation and political survival. Of course, the easiest way to remove this government almost immediately would be through a vote of no confidence in the House of Commons by MPs. Having the confidence of the House of Commons is central to any government's authority. Governments that lose a confidence vote in the past have either resigned in favour of an alternative government, or the Prime Minister has requested a dissolution from the monarch, triggering a general election. But we don't necessarily need new legislation. Labour MPs know the message that their constituents are sending them. They know how deeply unpopular the Prime Minister is. They no longer want him to be in charge. As the Leader of the Opposition has said on several occasions, Labour MPs have an opportunity to join with the Conservatives and remove this failing Prime Minister from office by uniting on a vote of no confidence, because that is what would be in the best interests of this country. After all of Labour's pre-election promises, it is no wonder that people are feeling fed up. They feel utterly betrayed. That's why it is important that today members across the chamber listen to the message that the petitioners are sending. The Prime Minister and this government have run out of road. The sooner we see the back of them, it will be the better for our country. Thank you, Mrs Barker.
The question is that this House has considered E-petition 734311 relating to the public being given a right to a vote of no confidence. I call Lib Dem spokesperson Sarah Gibson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Ms Barker, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship. And I thank the Petitions Committee for this important debate and to the 120,000 people across the country who signed the petition. I know from speaking to my own constituents from Lynham to Corsham that people feel frustrated, unheard and disappointed. People expect governments to keep promises and to deliver, even if they did not vote for the political party that assumes office, as the Honourable Member has mentioned. People are crying out for action on the cost of living, the NHS, not endless Westminster soap operas. Unfortunately, like his countless Conservative predecessors in years gone by, I have to agree with the Honourable Member that the Prime Minister seems distracted by his own survival, leaving the rest of us to pay the price. The question today is not simply about constitutional mechanisms, but about the feeling that this government is not delivering. Across the United Kingdom, families are struggling with the cost of living crisis. Access to the NHS, healthcare remains an uphill struggle. Businesses, particularly in rural areas like Wiltshire, are not being supported to grow. This petition is about a lack of trust. And the government's official response to this position and its ongoing failure to deliver does little to restore the faith of anyone who has asked us to be here today. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Opposition spokesperson Mike Wood.
Thank you, Mrs Barker, and let me begin by also thanking the more than 120,000 people across the United Kingdom who have signed this petition that's led to today's debate, and also joining my honourable friend in acknowledging the many organisations that have engaged constructively with this issue, many of which have already been named: Unlock Democracy and its Chief Executive, our former member of this House, Tom Brake, the Hansard Society and the Electoral Reform Society and many others that have worked on an independent basis to review our constitutional arrangements. Now, members will clearly have different views on this proposal, varying with their views on the effectiveness of this government. But the number of signatures really does demand that we treat this petition with the utmost seriousness and respect. The petition understandably calls for a further mechanism that would allow the public to remove a government that no longer commands public confidence. My honourable friend read out an excerpt from their petition where they say that they feel that they have seen the opposite of what the government promised before the election. And of course, many people across the country, in all of our constituencies, will recognise that sentiment. The government does seem to have lurched from error to error, from crisis to crisis, and decisions that have been made have damaged the economy, they've undermined business, they've driven up unemployment, they've increased debt and left communities and public services struggling. But above all, I think they have really hit people's confidence in government, having been promised so much and seen so little delivered. Whether that's veterans being dragged through the courts or sovereign territory being conceded, the public can see that it is not getting what it expected. Indeed, it's not getting what the government said in some cases only months ago, before those 15 major U-turns. Commitments made before the election had been abandoned, whether the promise of no taxes on rising people, which had been broken, pensioners left struggling after winter fuel payments, and the many others that my honourable friend has raised in his opening speech. But I think the crux of this debate comes down to perhaps the biggest promise that the Prime Minister made before the election, the one where he pledged the highest standards in public life for government of service, but instead has delivered scandal after scandal, many of the government's own making. And just this weekend, we saw the Inquiries Minister having to resign after he was investigated by his own department. And so it really is no surprise to see members of the public signing petitions like this to try to regain an element of control from a government elected with such an enormous majority that is failing to deliver what is being promised. But whilst the public frustration is clear and understandable, we must look carefully at the proposal itself. We must be careful that any new mechanism must work in all circumstances. The previous government, of course, did introduce a recall mechanism for those members of Parliament who had been found guilty of certain either criminal offences or serious breaches of the standards of this House. It allowed their constituents to decide whether they wanted those members of Parliament to continue. And I'm not necessarily against looking at whether that principle can be expanded to a national level, but we'd have to think very carefully as to how that can be done. We certainly want our political systems to be more responsive to the electorate, but we need to be very careful how that can be done within a parliamentary rather than presidential election system, as exists in many of those countries that do have the ability for public to trigger elections or recall at a central level, because it is the electorate who choose us, and it is the electorate who remove each of us if they wish at a general election. And under our parliamentary system, a government holds office because it commands the confidence of this House, and that is a fundamental principle that our system and our democracy relies on, as the Cabinet Manual explicitly states. So government's authority flows from its ability to command the confidence of the elected House of Confidence. And so, as my honourable friend said in opening, that confidence can be tested at any time through a vote of confidence or, of course, a vote of no confidence. And as the Leader of the Opposition has encouraged, that option is available for those members of Parliament whose constituents feel that we need to have a general election. I would urge all constituents who feel that way to make sure that their representatives in Parliament are aware of the strength of their feeling, because the conventions of parliamentary democracy have served us well. And introducing a direct recall mechanism for removing a government or for triggering a general election before the parliamentary term was due to expire would obviously raise significant practical and constitutional questions, some of which have already been highlighted, such as whether a successful public vote of no confidence would automatically trigger a general election or simply require a change of Prime Minister to form a new government within an existing Parliament, whether change in personnel would suffice. And as my honourable friends mentioned, what threshold would demonstrate genuine national support that would represent a need to, or would suggest that the government has irretrievably lost the confidence of the British people, rather than going through what might be temporary unpopularity at a time when it needs to make difficult but possibly necessary choices. Would that be at the level that had been set for recall petitions for individual MPs, where we've seen that threshold has tended to be very low, and in almost all cases, once a petition has been triggered, the threshold has been met? That would risk leading to some instability, or would we be looking at a higher threshold? Would we want 50% of those registered to vote? Would we want more voters than perhaps a government secured at the previous general election? Because, as has already been mentioned, if the threshold was too low, the risk is that well-funded groups could repeatedly attempt to destabilise any government of any political party, and of course the risk of that including perhaps outside actors with their own motives would be something that I think anybody would have to seriously consider before making constitutional changes of this significance. On a national level, how could we be confident that the signatures were verified? Obviously, where we have postal votes in a parliamentary or local council election, there is something to compare against, but unless we're requiring signatures alongside voter registrations, which would very much go against the direction that I know the government is setting out in this evening's legislation, then there would be unlikely to be any definitive database against which any signature on a petition could be compared. And how could we prevent petitions from being launched back-to-back, creating permanent instability? I mean, these are some of the questions that might be asked that I don't think are minor details. They really are fundamental before we should be looking at major constitutional change, because we have seen the consequences of poorly considered constitutional reform in the past. I mean, we saw unintended consequences from the Fixed Term Parliaments Act, which was obviously introduced with generally the noblest of motives, but the actual impact of which at a time when there wasn't a consensus within Parliament, but there wasn't a supermajority to dissolve Parliament and allow for fresh elections, it did not seem to have been properly considered. So while we should be cautious about rewriting the Constitution, we cannot ignore the clear message that is being sent by petitions such as this. And as my honourable friend said, it's only weeks ago that more than 3 million people signed a petition calling for a general election, just one of a number of petitions expressing similar sentiments. And that level of public anger should concern every member, whether or not they happen to agree in this case that this government is not delivering. It should be of concern across the political spectrum that people do feel unheard and ignored. And so I would urge, as I said, those who have signed this petition and others seeking an early election to make sure that their representatives are aware of their view and encouraging them, if appropriate, to pursue that constitutional route, because governments that lose the confidence of the House have historically either resigned or sought a general election, and governments where a majority of their members have constituents who have lost confidence in the government, I don't think can continue for too long. So, Mrs. Barker, after the promises made at the last election, it is no wonder that so many of our electors feel let down, and that's why today's debate matters. It sends a clear signal from the public to Parliament, and the message is simple. People want accountability, they want honesty, they want the ability to take back that control, even where a government does have a very large majority, such as this one. But above all, I think they want competence and they want a government that delivers. This government is fast running out of road, and the sooner that the country is given the chance to choose a new direction, the better. And ahead of the next general election, we will certainly be looking at what mechanisms might be appropriate and effective to allow voters to retain control in between general elections. But we would be reluctant to rush into committing to specific mechanisms until we've had a chance to properly consider what the consequences, intended and unintended, of such mechanisms would be.
Minister Anna Turley.
Thank you very much, Mrs Barker. It is, as always, a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. Thank you so much. And I'd also like to thank the Honourable Member for Berwickshire, Roxburgh and Selkirk for moving this debate today, and also the Honourable Members for Chippenham and for Dumfries and Galloway for their contributions. And I'd particularly like to thank the Opposition Shadow Minister for Kingswood and South Staffordshire for his really thoughtful analysis, I thought, of some of the questions and challenges that this debate has provoked. The Honourable Member has brought this debate forward on behalf of thousands of signatories of the E-petition, asking for the public to be granted the right to a vote of no confidence in the government. As members here will know only too well, at the heart of our parliamentary democracy is the willingness of all our political parties to engage in debates, sometimes robustly, on the critical issues which affect our constituents' lives. And so it's important that we are here today, because although the government does not agree with the central premise of the petition being debated today, we will always respect the public's right to voice their opinions, particularly in this place, through their elected members of Parliament. And petitions debates, I think, are an important means by which to do this. Madam Chair, as ever, I'm grateful for the opportunity to respond to this debate on behalf of the government. Now, in our parliamentary democracy, the government of the day holds office by virtue of its ability to command the confidence of the House of Commons. The composition of the Commons, as we know, is decided at the general election, and this is brought about, a general election is brought about by the Prime Minister requesting the dissolution of Parliament from the Sovereign within 5 years. Now, in recent years, thanks to the instability caused by the reckless decisions of the party opposite, the public had the opportunity to decide not just in 2015, but in 2017 and again in 2019, before the last general election was held in 2024. It is, of course, quite unusual to have so many general elections in such a short space of time, and is a reflection of the previous government's chaos. And I think sometimes as a result, of course...
Giving way. For the record, is it not also important just to record that in each of those elections, with the exception of the last, the Conservative vote actually rose?
That's absolutely on the record, but the reason we had these general elections was because of the chaos and the instability that his government brought about, including the resignation, which I'll come on to talk about, of a wide number of ministers. But I think as a result of this instability, some people, particularly politicians, and I think even, dare I say, our dear friends in the media and the political commentariat, have often become addicted to the drama and instability in politics. And I'm afraid I'm sorry to disappoint them today, but, Madam Chair, we were elected to end that chaos, to return the UK to stable and secure government, and I'm proud that we are doing just that.
I'm very much looking forward to the ending of this chaos. It seems we're completely marred in it. But as a former member of the Fourth Estate, I was a journalist for a long time. I'm always very concerned when politicians blame the media. I don't think it's the media that are creating the chaos. They're simply reporting on it.
I recognise my honourable friend's distinction, and I think it's, it's absolutely right. I enjoy very much myself the role of our Fourth Estate, but I think there are many who constantly seek upheaval and drama in politics, which, for those of us who are focused on delivering for the British people, can, I think, sometimes become a bit of a distraction. And as I, as members here, know well, holding the government to account doesn't simply stop between general elections. This has never been the case. Parliament remains sovereign, and there are opportunities for ministers across the government, including the Prime Minister, to account for their actions and explain what they are doing to deliver the promise of change the public voted for in 2024. At the last general election, the Labour Party promised to take action following years of Tory chop and change, and I'm sure we all remember the collapse of Boris Johnson's government, with 43 members of that administration resigning in one day. Now, our long-standing constitutional arrangements facilitate stability, whilst balancing the need to test the confidence in the government of the day in the elected House of Commons. Altering these arrangements could risk creating a constant revolving door, the inability to achieve anything, and would cost significant cost to the public purse, given the expenses associated with administering general elections. Overall, such changes would only serve to undermine public trust in politics, create more instability and paralysis in government. I remind honourable members that our constituents already have a clear route to influence the decisions made at the highest levels of government. All of us here know our constituents are able and do make representations to us as our local constituency MPs, and we in turn champion their views in this place and make representations to ministers in government. In the event that voters signal a desire for an election, the public's voice will be channelled effectively through their local MPs across the House. Now, Madam Chair, in 2024, the public voted for change. The public voted for over 400 brilliant Labour MPs in this House. After 14 years of chaos and uncertainty, Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, they voted for stability. Introducing a right for the public to have a vote of no confidence could undermine our parliamentary democracy, the duty and responsibility, indeed the primacy of this place, and could weaken the government of the day's ability to deliver its mandate. Now, those who signed this petition have said they feel the promises, and this has been referred to by honourable members in this place, they feel the promises we made to them at the last general election have not yet been delivered. Now, we all recognise that change takes time, but with every month and every pay packet that passes, I know that people will feel that change more and more. I'm extremely proud of the positive changes the Labour government has brought about since the last general election, and given the reference that's been made to manifesto pledges, I thought I'd give the honourable members opposite some good news to share with their constituents who have been questioning this about the many manifesto pledges that we have already delivered. For example, our landmark Employment Rights Act, which brings better maternity and paternity rights, an end to fire and rehire, and an end to exploitative zero-hours contracts. A manifesto promise delivered. An increase in the national minimum wage, rising to £12.71 next month. A sign that wages are up more so far under this government than under 10 years of the party opposite. A manifesto pledge delivered. The Border Security Command to crack down on criminal gangs. The manifesto promise delivered. The ending of the exemption of private school fees from VAT to enable investments that we're seeing every day in breakfast clubs so every child can start school ready to learn. A manifesto pledge delivered. The Strategic Defence Review and our plans to spend 2.5% of gross national income on defence to keep our country safe. A manifesto pledge delivered. The National Wealth Fund to support investment in our infrastructure across the country. I will.
I thank the Minister for giving way. Just to be clear, can she confirm that the government will not be spending 2.5% on defence this year?
Sorry, the manifesto pledge that we are implementing. Thank you for the clarity. The National Wealth Fund to support investment in our national infrastructure across the country delivered. Great British Energy to support the delivery of clean power by 2030 and the creation of well-paid jobs in the industries of the future, delivered. Great British Railways, bringing our railways back into public ownership, rebuilding trust in this vital public service, delivered. And the delivery of more than 5 million additional NHS appointments to bring down the record high waiting lists we inherited from the previous government. This is a whole raft of our manifesto pledges that we are delivering, and alongside these pledges we're seeing 500,000 children lifted out of poverty, we're seeing breakfast clubs across the country, we're seeing wider access to free school meals for families on universal credit, uniform costs capped, prescriptions frozen, rail fares frozen and energy bills coming down. So this is a sign that we are delivering on our manifesto. There's so much more we can do and that we will deliver before the general election. Now, Madam Chair, in summary, the introduction of a vote of no confidence by the public, we fear, would undermine the stability and the effectiveness of the government of the day in delivering the manifesto commitments that I've just set out. It would also undermine the primacy of this place, the cradle of democracy, by confusing the clear lines of accountability that general elections provide. The public's right to remove and replace the government of the day is already a key part of our democratic system and is undertaken freely and fairly after a parliament is dissolved for a general election. This is the historic and sovereign democratic system of the British people. For this reason, and the other reasons I've already set out, this is why the government cannot support this petition. This Labour government is focused on delivering the change the country voted for at the last general election. We will continue to listen to the public's views and deliver, as I've demonstrated, on the promises we made to them in our manifesto to end the 14 years of chaos and decline and to build a better Britain.
John Lamont to wind up.
Mrs Barker, I hadn't anticipated having an hour to fill for my... but I joke, I'm not going to fill the hour. Can I thank the petitioner for creating this petition and all the people who have signed it, and to the honourable and right honourable members who have participated in today's debate. It's been an example of quality over quantity, I feel. I particularly enjoyed the Minister's speech, I have to say. I do feel that she's living in a bit of a parallel universe in terms of the chaos, division and uncertainty which apparently this government is moving on from. I think for most of us in the real world, our perception is somewhat different. The Minister made much of the 14 years of Conservative rule. I mean, it's useful to remember, though, in those 14 years, and she mentioned the many elections that took place in that 14-year period, the 5 general elections that took place in the 14 years of Conservative rule, in 4 of them, the Conservative vote went up and more people were voting Conservative and more people had Conservative MPs as a consequence. So it wasn't entirely all bad. Now, this debate, this petition, I think is less about the constitutional change that was being proposed, but more the feeling that many people have of feeling let down and betrayed by this government, the sense of promises being broken, promises not being delivered, and a real sense of lack of direction. I think we all heard the Minister's account of all the things that have been achieved, apparently, during the time of Labour's time in office. But in many ways, that is part of the problem, this feeling that the government feels people should be grateful. People should feel that they're feeling best. But the reality out there in the real world is they don't feel any better. They feel things are getting worse. Unemployment is up, debt's going up, people are waiting longer for NHS appointments. People feel very let down. And I think this debate has been an opportunity to reflect on that. And I hope the petitioner and everybody who's been watching this debate has had the opportunity to listen to both sides of that debate. Thank you, Mrs Barker.
The question is that this House has considered E-petition 734311 relating to the public being given a right to a vote of no confidence. As many are of that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. This sitting is now suspended until 6 p.m.
Order. Jamie Stone to move the motion.
I now move that this House consider E-petition 747234 relating to the Secretary of State's power to cancel local elections. And I might say, Mr Mundell, it is a great pleasure to serve under your, what should we say, Caledonian chairmanship. We're old friends from the past. As Chair of the Petitions Committee, I believe I do speak for all its members when I say that it is always encouraging to see such strong public engagement in our democratic system. The petition has attracted well over 150,000 signatures from right across the United Kingdom. This level of support speaks positively to me that our citizens do indeed care deeply about the timing, integrity and accountability of local elections. I would therefore like to thank the petition's creator, Dr. Chris Barnes, and all those who've taken the time to add their names. Dr. Barnes, who I had the pleasure of meeting with prior to this evening. Now, the petition calls on the government to remove the Secretary of State's statutory power to postpone or cancel scheduled local elections. These, as we know, are powers conferred on the government by the powers in Section 87 of the Local Government Act of 2000. Dr. Barnes's petition states, and I quote, "The right to vote is sacred and inalienable," close quote, and he argues that elections due to take place in May 2026 and beyond should proceed as planned. Many signatories have expressed concern that postponement risks undermining democratic accountability and public trust. Last month, the government did indeed do a U-turn on this decision. Regardless, we're here to debate the principle at the heart of the initial decision to delay these elections. Now, in its official response, the government makes clear that the relevant powers are set out in legislation passed by Parliament. The government states that such powers are used only when there is strong justification, and that any use would be subject to parliamentary scrutiny through the statutory instrument process. The government has further indicated there is no current plans to amend the legislation in question, and adds that similar powers have previously been used in limited and specific circumstances, including in the context of local government reorganisation. So therefore, the debate before us concerns not only the principle of regular elections, but also the appropriate balance between statutory flexibility and democratic certainty. Now, I would suggest that local elections are the cornerstone of representative democracy. Councillors make decisions on housing, social care, planning, transport, and a range of many other services that directly impact on daily life. And I should know, having spent a good number of years as a councillor myself. I will give way to the honourable gentleman.
I thank the chairman of the committee. He's introducing this debate very well, if I might say so. I too was a local councillor in Basildon in the early 90s. Would he agree with me that it's a good thing that the government have done a reverse ferret so that we can now have local elections across the country, including in Labour-led Basildon, Labour-led South and Labour-led Thurrock, so that those people now have to face the electorate on their appalling record?
I thank the honourable member for a customary incisive intervention, shall we say. Local elections surely ensure these decisions are subject to scrutiny and renewal. The expectation that electors will have an opportunity to choose their representatives at predictable intervals is surely fundamental to public confidence. Now, independent bodies have indeed emphasised this very point. The Electoral Commission has stated that scheduled elections should, as a rule, proceed as planned and only be postponed in exceptional circumstances. It is cautioned that uncertainty around election timing can undermine public confidence and create difficulties for voters, campaigners and administrators alike. Similarly, the Electoral Reform Society expressed concern to me about the democratic implications of postponements that significantly extend councillors' terms. In particular, the Electoral Reform Society has warned that where delays coincide with electoral cycles, some councillors could even serve up to 7 years without facing the electorate. Oh, that I ever had that opportunity in my own councillor career. I would argue that such extensions risk weakening accountability and should prompt careful review of the safeguards surrounding the government's postponement powers. These concerns are shared to varying degrees right across the political spectrum. My own party has argued that local elections should not be treated as administrative conveniences, and we have emphasised the importance of protecting fixed and predictable electoral timetables. We've raised questions about the concentration of discretion in the hands of a single minister, and we have called for stronger safeguards and greater transparency where postponement is indeed proposed. Now, similarly, members from the Conservative Party have underlined the importance of upholding democratic mandates. However, some have reasoned that statutory powers, once conferred by Parliament, must be capable of being exercised where the law permits. Now, in response, the present government have stressed that the powers in question are not new and were established by Parliament to deal with defined circumstances, such as, I've already mentioned, the structural reorganisation of local government. The government argues that there must remain a mechanism to ensure orderly transitions where boundary change or authorities are merged, and that such decisions are subject to legislative oversight and are not to be exercised arbitrarily. I'm sure that within the debate that will follow, we will examine these points more closely. What does indeed unite these differing perspectives is a shared recognition that elections are not merely procedural events, they are the very means by which authority is conferred and renewed. Any decision to postpone them must therefore meet a very high threshold of justification and transparency. It was never, surely never, be motivated by self-interest, and that would instill distrust in our democracy, which is something very precious to all of us. This petition and the debate tonight it has prompted reflect a broader public anxiety about democratic accountability. In recent years, and we all know this, trust in political institutions has been tested. It's therefore understandable that proposals or decisions which affect when voters may next go to the polls attract scrutiny and, indeed, very strong opinion. At the very same time, Parliament has long recognised that exceptional circumstances may require flexibility. The legal framework governing elections is complex, and changes to local authority structures, emergencies or other significant disruptions may necessitate adjustments. But the question for this House is not whether elections matter, and I trust that all members of the House believe this, but how best to reconcile the principle of regular democratic renewal with the practical realities of governments. Now, the petition process exists precisely to enable such questions to be posed and examined. That is why we are here tonight. When substantial numbers of people across the country express concern in a democratic system, as they have with this particular petition, Parliament surely must listen to them. It is right that ministers have the opportunity today to set out clearly the legal basis for the powers concerned, the circumstances in which they may be used, and the safeguards that exist. It is also equally right that all members from all sides test these explanations where appropriate. Now, I hope that today's debate will contribute to the clarity, transparency and accountability, and I want to reassure all those who signed the petition that their concerns are being taken seriously in this debate tonight, because that is precisely what the Petitions Committee is all about. I will draw my conclusions, Mr Mundell, to a close, and I listen with the very greatest of interest to see what my colleagues here this evening have to say, and indeed how the Minister who has kindly represented the Government will respond. I thank you.
I remind members that they should bob if they wish to be called in the debate. The question is that this House has considered E-petition 747234 relating to the Secretary of State's power to cancel local elections. And I call Will Foster.
Mr Mundell, it's a pleasure to serve under your leadership this evening. I want to thank, as well as you for chairing this debate, I want to thank the people that signed this petition. We had almost 153,000 people from across the country signing this petition. 186 from my constituency of Woking signed it as well. And I think they signed it because we unreasonably lost our right to vote last year in Surrey County Council's elections, which were unreasonably taken away by the previous government. By this government. Now, did they lose their right to vote because of massive, significant events that meant we just couldn't go to vote? Was it a world war, First World War, Second World War? We've had them, where elections will have to be postponed. Was it the foot and mouth crisis in 2001? I will, yes.
Just as a matter of record, we had a general election in Britain in July 1945, when we were still involved in fighting the Second World War in the Far East. So if we could have a general election in wartime, I see no reason why we couldn't have local elections this May in peacetime.
I quite agree. My memory doesn't stretch back as far as this, but my honourable friend is completely right. We had elections were postponed just around serious wartime, foot and mouth in 2001. And obviously, we all remember, even I remember, the COVID pandemic that resulted in the 2020 elections having to be postponed. But in Surrey and across a lot of the country, people lost their right to vote, our right to vote, because of local government reorganisation. Not exactly an existential threat to our way of life, but that is how we lost that right to vote. Now, because of that, people in Surrey lost their right to vote, and we are now stuck with county councillors that were last elected in 2021. The only reason why I have Conservatives representing my constituency of Woking is because they haven't been able to be voted out of office since 2021. We've had every single year since then on Woking Borough Council, the Conservatives have put up candidates and lost every single election. Yet, we are starting to create a new council for my area, West Surrey Council. This is a once-in-a-generation opportunity to give a fresh start for my area, set a council that we haven't had for 50 years. But people are, in those meetings, setting in motion this once-in-a-generation opportunity that have lost their mandate. They've had their mandate expired, and I think that is completely unreasonable. And it's because of the use of the Secretary of State powers that this petition is opposing. I think after the recent month, the Secretary of State probably wished he never had this power in the first place. Therefore, I will turn to my questions to the Minister. Given the Government has now reversed its decision to postpone the 2026 local elections following legal advice, can the Minister confirm whether the same legal considerations applied to the 9 local council elections postponed in 2025, including Surrey County Council? Can she confirm to me and my constituents of Woking that those elections were lawfully postponed by confirming what legal advice the Government has had? And finally, what material change in circumstances occurred between the decision to postpone the 2026 local elections and the subsequent decision to reverse the postponement? Because this Government, Mr Mundell, has not been open and transparent with the legal advice they have received, my constituents of Woking, the 156,000 people that have signed this petition, have lost what little trust they had in government and politics. This Government can start to regain that trust by publishing their legal advice and ensuring no one minister can cancel local elections in the future. Thank you.
Call John Milne.
Thank you, Mr Mundell, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. I'd also like to thank all the people in my constituency of Horsham and indeed across the country for signing this petition in such numbers and with such great speed as well. Very revealing the distress that it caused. So the first question is, how do we get into this mess? The handling of the local government reorganisation process by this government has been nothing short of shambolic. Councils across the country, including my own area of Sussex, have been forced to make complex and controversial decisions at breakneck speed. LGR was not in the Labour manifesto. Such a huge change, yet it wasn't even mentioned. In Sussex, as in many places, it was obvious that councils operating under a rainbow of different political persuasions would struggle to find consensus over new boundaries and structures. But the government insisted on going ahead anyway. However, the decision to allow councils to postpone their elections was even worse. it's become very apparent that the councils who asked for delays did not do so for practical logistical reasons, but simply because they were afraid they would be dumped out of office. And that is exactly the situation at West Sussex County Council, my own council. The Conservative ruling group at West Sussex have known for some time that they would face oblivion at the next election. When offered the chance to save themselves last year with what was described as an election postponement, they reached out and grabbed it. They probably couldn't believe their luck when they were given the opportunity to cancel elections again this year, at least until the government's handbrake U-turn in the face of probable legal embarrassment. Holding elections at such short notice places great strain on council officers, especially given the pressures of ongoing unitarisation, and I really feel for the pressure that they're under. However, it is the right outcome, even if we have reached it in the worst possible way. Repeatedly denying residents the right to vote was wrong, wrong, wrong. By the time they'd finished, the Conservative group in West Sussex would have retained control for all of 7 years, far beyond the 4 years they were originally voted in for and for which they had a mandate. The government's U-turn, which means elections are back on, is tough on councillors who were recently voted in by by-elections, which were only called because of the delay. That includes 2 Lib Dems in my own constituency of Horsham. If the government had let elections go ahead when they should have done last year, then we would never have wasted money on by-elections that never needed to happen. Across the country, of the 30 councillors who asked for a delay this year, 26 were Labour, 3 Conservative and 1 Lib Dem, which was in Cheltenham. I would say in defence of Cheltenham that their position is unique because of recent ward boundary changes. All 40 councillors were only recently elected in 2024 in what was a specially timetabled election, and they are currently just 2 years into their 4-year term, or their normal 4-year term. However, they will be now forced to hold another election halfway through. I'm not surprised that the elections issue has caused such anger across the country, leading to this petition, because this is an issue about as fundamental as you can get, the right to vote. I fully support the petitioners in my own constituency of Horsham, and I'm glad that they're going to get their chance to vote after all, even if it does mean I'm going to have to spend a lot of my weekends knocking on doors until May, like the rest of us. I don't doubt that the Conservatives will be swept from power in West Sussex. In the last few years, the political map of Sussex has changed beyond recognition. In 2023, Horsham District Council became Lib Dem for the first time this century. And in 2024, I had the honour of becoming the first non-Conservative MP for Horsham in 144 years. So I look forward to May 7th, when we can finally bring West Sussex County Council kicking and screaming up to date. To conclude, Mr Mundell, this was a mess that we did not need to get into. So I support the proposal in the petition to remove the right of the Secretary of State to cancel elections. We have only to look at what has just happened to know, to be certain, that it's a right that is wide open to political exploitation, as has just happened. So I hope the Minister will consider amending the legislation as proposed. Thank you.
You wish to speak, Mr Farage?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr Chairman. No taxation without representation. It's quite a powerful political adage. It's worked well over the years. And that's really what people were facing in many parts of the country, paying their council tax, but not being able to have a say. And in certain cases, elected county councillors who would stay in position for a full 7 years. But it wasn't just the minister that did this. It was done with the connivance of the Conservative Party, who did everything they could to deny the vote in Norfolk, in Suffolk, in East and West Sussex, and initially in Surrey, doing their best to stop people voting for 2 consecutive years. And the Lib Dems did get in on the act in Cheltenham, though I will grant you slightly different circumstances. Talking of the Lib Dems, I've been having a very good chat with a very prominent Liberal Democrat who I get on rather well with, Sir Bob Russell, who of course represented Colchester for many, many years, who made the point. The last time there was fundamental local government reorganisation in England, it was 50 years ago. But no one suggested that elections should be cancelled, delayed, postponed. In fact, the debate about the shape of local government reorganisation became part of those campaigns, and they were issues upon which people voted. So I'm very proud of the fact that 153,000 people signed this petition, but I'm even prouder of the fact that 4.6 million people will get the vote on May the 7th because of the judicial review that I took against the government. So I'm very proud of that, and we will go on, reform will go on, fighting for proper open democracy. But what is clear is that Article 87 of the Local Government Act of 2000 gives way too much delegated power to a minister of any government, and that elections are completely fundamental to liberty and freedom in our country. And I think what we need to do, and I'd ask the government to support this, is we should change Article 87 of that LGA Act to make sure that in future any delays to election, for whatever reason they may be, have to be the subject of primary legislation, an open debate and a vote by all members of Parliament. And if we do that, we'll never, ever finish up in this awful mess and lack of trust in politics again. Thank you.
I commend the chairman of the Petitions Committee for the very skillful way in which he introduced this very important topic. The government's original reason for postponing these elections was because councils were too busy with local government reform. Although in Essex we had the bizarre example that some that were involved in LGR thought they weren't too busy to have elections, and some involved in LGR, mainly Labour-led councils, thought they were too busy to have elections. Now, I served on Basildon Council in the early 1990s, when we went round this buoy before. That was under John Major's premiership. And the idea then was not to have mayors, but to have one unitary system across the county. And I was involved in the negotiations between Basildon and other authorities. In the end, Mr. Mundell, to cut a long story short, the whole thing broke down because no one could agree on who to team up with. There were too many old rivalries, there were too many differences between towns, and the whole thing collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. So when I heard we were going round this buoy again, I confess, perhaps based on my previous experience, I was deeply sceptical. And I remember saying to my own local Railing Whitford Conservative Association over 3 years ago at one of our quarterly executive meetings, don't take it as axiomatic that this will all happen. It fell apart last time, it could yet fall apart again. And where are we now? We were supposed to have mayoral elections this May. The government has postponed those mayoral elections by 2 years to May 2028. We're supposed to have a mayoral combined authority. So now we face the bizarre position where we would have a combined authority which is not elected. It's an unelected committee of a handful of senior councillors drawn from several constituent councils, but with no mayor. The fate of the combined authority now appears to be effectively in abeyance, Mr. Mundell. And Labour's whole argument for doing this is to move from a two-tier system to a single-tier system. That's not true. The two-tier system we have at the moment is Essex County Council as the upper tier, and then a series of district, borough, now city councils below. The third tier of parish councils and town councils are basically unaffected either way. So we're now moving to another two-tier system where we'll have a mayor and a combined authority as the upper tier and a bunch of unitary authorities, whether 3 or 4 or 5, as the lower tier. So we go through all this cost and misery and uncertainty to go from one two-tier system to another. So the whole argument is nonsense from the get-go. Then, moreover, I have been door knocking in my constituency for 25 years, and I have never, once, ever had an elector say to me on a doorstep, "I want a mayor of Essex." Take it from me, Mr Mundell, Essex people, if they want something, are not shy to let their politicians know. I see a member for Clacton is grinning at this. He's obviously experienced this himself. But they don't want a mayor of Essex, or if they do, they haven't said so. It has no demos. There is no public demand for it. People are not clamouring for a mayor. We've never had one in 1,000 years. But suddenly the government think that we need some Sadiq Khan for Essex. Well, I can tell you that is about as popular as a bowl of... Well, anyway, it's not very popular. So where do we now sit? Southend Unitary Authority, Southend City Council, forgive me, after my great friend Sir David campaigned for it for many years. If he were here, he would chide me now. Southend City conducted their own consultation about a year ago. 2/3 of the people who replied said they didn't want any change at all. So then the government instituted a wider county-wide, and that's Greater Essex, so that includes Southend and Thurrock, for the avoidance of doubt, a county-wide consultation which closed on the 15th of January. Now, perhaps when the Minister replies, she could tell us some 6 weeks on what the result of that consultation was. And if she doesn't have that to hand, perhaps she could tell us when she intends to publish the results of that consultation. I'm sure before the local elections, before we get to Purdah in the 3rd week of March, so that the good people of Essex know what their fellow county people said before we go to the polls. I'm going to take a punt on it. I'm going to say it's going to reveal that there was very little enthusiasm at all for local government reorganisation whatsoever in Essex. And if the Minister wants to prove me wrong, then she can publish the results of the consultation. So, only a few other quick points to make, Mr Mundell. Labour sought to postpone these elections, and now, thanks to campaigning, I admit, by Reform and by the Conservatives and others, but overwhelmingly due to public pressure, which perhaps we have both managed to articulate in our different ways, the government have given in, and now those elections are back on, and so the people in Southend and in Basildon and in Thurrock can go to the polls and can express peacefully and democratically their opinion on whether or not the Labour mob that run those 3 councils should be allowed to carry on. I give way to the right honourable gentleman from Northern Ireland because no debate in Parliament will be complete without it.
Jim Shannon.
Well, it's been enough for me, so well, you know. The elections, does the honourable member agree that the elections aren't just bureaucratic processes? They're how communities hold leaders to account, set local priorities and influence decisions that affect their everyday lives. The fact that anybody should try to stop an election will backfire on those who try to do that. And does he agree that when it comes down to people's opinions, as he expressed very, very clearly, that's the priority. Let people decide. Don't deny them their right to the ballot box.
Well, I have 2 responses. I have a great deal of time for him, as he knows. One, the chairman of the Petitions Committee laid out very clearly the responsibility of local government at the beginning of his speech, so I shan't try the patience, Mr Mundell, of you or the rest of the House by repeating them. But it's everything from planning to housing, adult social care, education. These things affect people's everyday lives. They're really important. And they should have a democratic right to decide which councillors run those services that they pay for as customers via their council tax. So, of course, there should be elections. And secondly, and on a personal note, and I hope he and other colleagues here will understand this, nobody delayed the general election. I went into battle at 20 points behind in the polls. No one gave me a bye. I had to fight to be here. I had to convince my employers in my constituency to renew my contract of employment to represent them, and so did everyone else in this House this evening. So why should it be different for local councillors? Why don't they have to get their contract of employment, in effect, renewed by their employers at the ballot box? So I thank the Minister for the fact that the local elections will now go ahead. She may recall we had some sparky exchanges in the Commons chamber about this, but we've ended up with the right decision, albeit after far too long. And so the people of Essex will be, if they wish to support the government's bonkers housing targets, mandatory and top-down, imposed by some Whitehall civil servant that couldn't find Essex with a tom-tom, and supported by a mad computer algorithm. If they want to go and vote for that, they can. If, conversely, they want to vote for Conservative councillors who care about the area they live in, who want to defend the Greenbelt and carry on providing good services to people at a cost that they can afford, then they've got the chance to vote Conservative, although, for the record, other products are available. So that means people can actually have elections in Essex and pass a verdict, and I very much hope that in my corner of the world, for Essex County Council, for Rochford District Council, for Basildon Borough Council, they will vote Conservative. But however they vote, whoever they choose, whoever they give that very important mandate to run those really important services, the fundamental point is they will be allowed to exercise their right to choose. And it's this government that very nearly took that away, and we should never let them forget it. Other than that, though, I have no firm view on the matter.
Andrew Rossendale.
Thank you, Mr Mundell. I say to the Minister that cancelling elections is always wrong unless there is an extreme situation where that necessitates a postponement of an election. I can't think of many examples in recent years where that was necessary. I remember when Margaret Thatcher abolished the GLC. She extended the GLC's term by 1 year only, and then the GLC was rightly abolished. I remember during the COVID pandemic, the Greater London Authority's term was extended by 1 year, but then it was shortened in the next term, so a 5-year term, then a 3-year term. Cancelling elections, I think, in this case, Mr Chairman, purely for political reasons, is fundamentally dishonest of this government. And it is only, I have to say, because of the actions of my honourable friend and member for Clacton, who took a judicial review that forced the government to do another U-turn on this issue, allowing the rights of the people of this country to vote for their chosen local councillors in the forthcoming elections on the 7th of May. But I'd like to make a further point, because democracy isn't only about how you vote in local elections and who you choose as your local councillors. It's also about the structure of local government. My borough is the London Borough of Havering, as the Minister knows only too well, because I've spoken about it on many occasions. And I was rather disappointed that my honourable friend, the member for Rayleigh and Wickford, didn't acknowledge that the London Borough of Havering actually is also an Essex borough. But the problem is, Mr Mundell, is that the people of my borough have never been given the chance to choose whether we want to be under the Mayor of London and the Greater London Authority, or whether we would prefer to be a unitary authority or under this new Greater Essex. We simply don't get given the chance to decide. We aren't asked. Our opinion doesn't matter. So we are forced into an artificial Greater London structure which doesn't suit the interests of my borough. It means that we are paying vast sums of money in to effectively subsidise inner London. It means that things like ULEZ are imposed upon us. It means that planning is taken out of our control. So we are Londonised, becoming a concrete jungle. All these things has no democratic mandate from the people of Havering. So in postponing elections, it's really just as bad denying local people the right to choose what kind of structure they would like to be in. And I can tell you, and my honourable member friend for Clacton was in Romford outside the town hall only last week, and the popularity in my borough for a local referendum to decide to be unitary authority outside of Greater London is extremely high in my borough. But I say to the Minister, if we believe in democracy, we really do need to be given the chance to make those decisions. And so, the key point here, Mr. Chairman, is that we are only debating this issue, and I commend the Honourable Member for Caithness, Sutherland and Easter Ross for bringing the petition to the House. Because, frankly, it's a disgrace that we have to do this. It's a disgrace that so many people had to sign a petition purely to demand their right to vote in a democratic election on the 7th of May. And in my borough, we were voting anyway. There was no postponement in our election. We're looking forward to quite a big change in our borough, in Havering. And I think there will be a big change because people are tired of being governed by City Hall. They're being tired by being governed by a town hall that isn't really representative of the local community. And I think there will be a change, and I firmly believe it will be the first Reform UK Council in the Greater London area. And I would like to make one final point to the Honourable Member for Woking, and I agreed with everything he said, actually. And on this, I think the Liberal Democrats have an honourable position on this in terms of democracy. I think there was Cheltenham, I think there was a little issue there, but let's not worry about that. I think the Liberal Democrats were very clear that there should have been elections. But what I would say to him is that under these restructuring of local government, I think one of the issues in his particular new local authority, it being called West Surrey, surely it should be called West Surrey and South Middlesex to actually reflect the true historic county identity of that particular area. Because if you're going to name local authorities, you give them names that actually reflect the geography and the history of that area. And so it's very important that that area of Middlesex is included in the name of the new unitary authority for that area. I hope he agrees with that. I'll give way, most certainly.
Thank you very much for highlighting this. I have some sympathy for this. I know Liberal Democrat colleagues in Spelthorne have highlighted this issue. Obviously, we're going to have a new council called West Surrey, which is 1/6 South Middlesex. I know the government are considering this suggestion. I hope they give it due consideration. I think one of the concerns being that it's only 1/6 South Middlesex, so why should it be half the name? However, what I would highlight, I'm more concerned with the fact that this council is going to start with over £4 billion worth of debt that it's going to inherit from the former Conservative administrations. That's my more priority rather than the name, but I do have some sympathy.
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman. I'm glad he has sympathy with it because actually local identity matters, and giving a council a name which actually everyone feels representative by is actually very important. And so I hope that will become a reality. And I know the Middlesex Heritage Society is very strong in campaigning for this, and even I get requests to raise this, even though I'm not a Middlesex MP. I am an Essex MP and proud of it. Mr. Chairman, in closing, can I say one final thing? Is I hope the government have learned a lesson here. Democracy has been fought for over many centuries, many generations. It's not something you just discard or postpone or delay purely for political advantage. And I'm afraid the government have been called out on this issue. And I believe that the denial of democracy is something that the Minister really should apologise for today. And thank goodness there was a threat of a judicial review, and that prompted the government to do that U-turn, which means that the people of this country can properly vote in local elections on the 7th of May.
Thank you. I call Gideon Amos on behalf of the Liberal Democrats.
Thank you, Mr Blundell, and I'm keen to congratulate you in securing quality, if not quantity, in the number of speakers in this debate. And it's a pleasure to serve with you in the chair. And I'd also thank my honourable friend, member for Caithness, Sutherland and Easter Ross, for introducing the debate, and also the 262 constituents of Taunton and Wellington who signed this petition. They're right. The Secretary of State's power to cancel elections, certainly without recourse to Parliament, should be removed. And Liberal Democrats opposed the cancelling of these elections and are opposing top-down reorganisations of councils in various places. We opposed the cancelling of the elections at the time and in Parliament. That's why we tabled both a prayer motion in the House of Commons and a fatal motion in the House of Lords, which would have stopped the government's secondary legislation that cancelled these elections. Unfortunately, the Conservatives did not support that in the House of Lords, and therefore the cancellation went ahead. By delaying elections to certain local authorities, incumbent councillors were permitted to remain in post for longer than their elected period, directly contravening, as I think another honourable member said, the democratic mandates given to them by the voters. Simply moving the goalposts and silencing millions of voters is totally unacceptable and a subversion of the democratic process, Mr Blundell. The public deserves to know how such an obviously undemocratic plan was allowed to get so far. So even though the government have said they won't provide it, we are going to repeat, as Liberal Democrats, our call to see the full legal and other advice the government relied upon, so the public can see exactly how this plan came to fruition. But it's not just this government, Mr Blundell. In 2021, in May, 5,000 councillor elections went ahead, but not the elections which the Conservative government cancelled in Cumbria, Carlisle, South Lakeland and Somerset. Hundreds of elections to council seats were cancelled, again because of often unpopular top-down reorganisations. What the Conservatives began, this government has continued with an unwanted top-down reorganisation of many council areas. As I say, it wasn't just Cumbria and Carlisle, it was my own area of the county of Somerset. But in Somerset, the Conservatives took it to extremes, Mr Blundell. The 2021 election delay to facilitate the unwanted Somerset-wide unitarisation was being discussed by ministers with the then Conservative leader, whilst the Conservatives' previous merger of two Somerset district councils was barely a year old. The merged district council, which then went on to become part of the new Somerset Unitary, has gone down in history now as the shortest-lived local authority in history, wasting millions of pounds, and the public will was ignored then, just as far too often it's being ignored now. In both those Somerset mergers, calls for the last government to respect a referendum or a poll of local people were ignored, elections were delayed, and a new super-large council 60 miles across with around 20 towns and 400 villages were lashed together for Conservative convenience, even though the public voted clearly instead for two smaller unitary councils. Now, just like then, local authorities have been grappling with the severe and additional pressures the government's reorganisation is placing on their budgets. And as a result, and because of the government flip-flopping and the lack of clear and prompt communication about whether local elections will go ahead, many are now scrambling to prepare for elections in just a few weeks' time. Staffed by electoral services officers, many of whose district council employers have been lined up for abolishment. Or even abolition, Mr Blundell. Does this not raise, Mr Blundell, serious questions as to whether they'll be able to deliver the free and fair elections which are essential? I therefore ask the Minister, given the government has now reversed its decision to postpone the 2026 local elections, can the Secretary of State or the Minister confirm whether the same legal considerations applied to the 9 local elections postponed in 2025? And does the Minister believe the postponement of the elections by the Conservative government in 2021 was lawful or not? And as the Honourable Member for Rayleigh and Wickford has raised, the characteristic here is cancelling elections for unpopular top-down reorganisations. In Somerset, we are going to be lashed together with Dorset, Wiltshire and some other authorities to become Wessex. And like him, when I've been visiting villages flooded out on the Somerset levels, none of them have come up to me and say, what I really want is a Metro Mayor for the Somerset levels. Unless you can bring back King Alfred, I suspect they're not going to back the idea at all. My other question for the Minister is, will the Minister make clear what amount of taxpayers' money has been paid on legal costs arising from proceedings related to the proposed postponement of local elections? These are real questions the government needs to answer. We on these benches oppose the cancelling of elections. We'll keep asking those questions. We have consistently stood against the cancellation, both by the Conservatives and by this government, because we are clear The decision to cancel should never have been taken, and democracy delayed is democracy denied. Thank you, Mr Mandel.
Shadow Minister David Simmons.
Mr Mandel, a pleasure to serve with you in the chair this afternoon at a time when Parliament is very active in the world of local government. And I think that shows how much it matters. We heard from the member for Rayleigh and Wickford both about his local government experience, but also about the diversity of different services that local authorities provide. Over 800 different provided by each council on average, which reflects the level of interest that all governments and all parties have in making sure that the organisation and structure is correct. As an opposition party, Mr Mandel, we've approached the issue of local government reorganisation with the seriousness with which we treated the same issue when we were in government. But where we are this evening in looking at this petition, and where we've been in recent weeks, is fairly and squarely a mess of this government's making. And I think we need to reflect that when in government, we undertook, as the member for Rayleigh and Wickford described, a number of reorganisations of local authorities, in each case committing that elections would never be deferred for more than a 12-month period, and they never were. And there are good grounds for saying to our constituents, why spend millions of taxpayers' money electing councillors to an authority that you are about to abolish? Better instead to have the elections for the successor authorities. And at the outset of this process, the government said to all of those areas, and if we reflect on the former minister's reports, which are well listed in Hansard, we saw a very clear devolution priority programme in which those councils were told, you're going to be abolished, the government will bring forward that legislation, elections will go ahead for new unitary authorities or new mayors in your local area. So democracy will not be denied. You are engaging with this process in good faith. The voters will have their say, but what we're not going to do is elect people to councils that are about to be abolished. And the reason why we're in this position today is because the government has signally failed to deliver on its devolution priority programme. Just one of those local authority areas, Surrey, has achieved the status of getting its new unitary authorities approved by Parliament. Just one, 18 months into a process which the government has described as a flagship programme. And when we reflect on the process that Parliament has followed, at the outset of this, the former minister brought to a delegated legislation committee in March 2025 proposals that there would be the postponement of the elections in all of the devolution priority programme areas. The Conservative Party, the membership on that committee, voted against those proposals. And we did so because we weren't convinced by what the minister was setting out about the deliverability of the underlying devolution priority programme. And we have been proved to be correct. And we made the argument that in a situation where the government was clear that these authorities were going to be abolished, but had yet to bring forward any clear programme for the creation of the new mayors, had yet to pass the legislation in the English Devolution and Communities Bill that would set up the framework for that, to be cancelling elections was not a responsible thing to do. Nonetheless, the government, despite those warnings from the Conservative opposition, pressed ahead. Following that, of course, there was a reshuffle in government. But at this point, Mr Mandel, I think it's the committee's value to the committee to reflect on the Gould principle, something which underlies decision-making, which says that when there are to be this nature of cancellations, a minimum of 6 months' notice is normally provided. And clearly, putting elections off for 12 months in authorities that at the end of that period were simply going to be 12 months closer to their abolition creates huge uncertainty for local voters. And when we look at the frequent urgent questions, the opportunities we've used in Hansard through departmental questions and through opposition day debates to raise this issue, it's clear that we've been seeking to hold the government to account. And I reflect, for example, that I was told in response to an urgent question in December that, to quote from Hansard, the government's intention is that all the elections scheduled for next May will go ahead next May. That's in the official report from November 2025. The following day, the Minister told the House that those mayoral elections scheduled for this May in these devolution areas were being cancelled after all. It is abundantly clear that there has been chaos in MHCLG, a complete lack of direction, and it has left local government leaders across the country who have been seeking to act in good faith with an eye to good use of taxpayers' money, but also to maintaining democracy in their areas, in an incredibly difficult position. And the fact that we've seen ministers literally 24 hours later reversing the position that they are telling Parliament has been characteristic of that entire process. So, Mr. Mundell, let's just reflect on the decisions that led to the most recent hokey-cokey, the government having made it clear that they were minded to press ahead and cancel those elections. Now, we know the feedback from local government leaders around the country is that they were placed under enormous pressure by the department, by ministers, to say that they wanted that cancellation to go ahead, to the extent of drafts of letters being sent back to council leaders asking them to say in more clear, more serious terms what the impact would be on devolution if those elections were to go ahead according to the schedule. And to their credit, many of those leaders, many of those local authorities resisted the pressure that they were put under. But that resulted in the Secretary of State making the announcement that he would be bringing forward proposals to cancel the elections in those 31 local authority areas, with Pendle being added, I think, 24 hours after the announcement was made. Again, characteristic of the chaotic approach the government has adopted. But what is curious about this whole process, Mr. Mundell, and this is the nub of the questions that I wish to put to the Minister. We've heard quite a lot from members of Reform about the judicial review. But I think we need to be clear. Reform did not win a judicial review against the government. The government surrendered without a shot being fired. They essentially offered no defence. The Secretary of State, with that judicial review coming into view, decided to reverse his decision. Had he brought forward legislation to Parliament to cancel or postpone these elections, that would have been beyond the scope of a judicial review, as parliamentary proceedings are. As was the case when we dealt with exactly the same set of questions on the basis of legal advice that the department had been provided with roughly 12 months beforehand. So the key question, Mr. Mundell, is what had changed? What was different that something that was advised to be unambiguously lawful, that was dealt with through the delegated legislation process, with clear, robust defence from ministers that this was the right thing to do and entirely in accordance with the measures set out in the 2000 Local Government Act, had become unlawful 8 or 9 months later. Now, there is very little, Mr. Mundell, that legal advisers have brought to the opposition's attention that suggests that had the Secretary of State pressed ahead with his decision, had he placed that before Parliament and Parliament had voted that those elections were to be cancelled, that that would be subject to challenge. But it is clear that the government would have had to set out, in defending a judicial review, the correspondence, the discussions that they had with all of those local authorities, that they were putting under such acute pressure to seek the cancellation of their elections. And the opposition is going to be pushing very hard, Mr. Mundell, to understand what it was that led the Secretary of State to delegate the decision to a different minister rather than make it himself as the legislation envisages, and instead to reverse, as the member for Rayleigh and Wickford decided, at the last minute, at huge cost, at huge impact on local authorities, many of whom, on the basis of the government's assurances, had released the polling stations, had told schools that they would be open on polling day now because the government had cancelled the elections, had stood down the polling clerks, the polling station staff, that they weren't going to need because the government had cancelled the elections, had told the police that they could stand down their planned patrols to make sure those elections could go ahead because the government was cancelling them, who now have to put that whole operation back together at incredibly short notice. Now, I know the Minister's answer in respect of the question of what changed is likely to be that the government does not discuss the basis of its legal advice. And that is a principle which governments of all parties have stuck to for many years. But given that the legal context of the decision made in March 2025, that decision which we as an opposition, I remind the committee, voted against, was that it was lawful for the government to do this and in accordance with custom and practice. What was different when the Secretary of State came to put that decision before Parliament nearly 12 months later? What had changed other than the grave concern of many Labour council leaders that they were facing a drubbing at the polls that would have led the Secretary of State to make the decision not to press forward, as he had indicated he would in his own judgment, with asking Parliament to agree through the legislative process that election cancellation? And I finish, Mr Mundell, with these points. In response to the understandable fury of many of those local leaders at the mess that they've been left with, the Secretary of State rather hastily announced £63 million of additional, as was described, capacity grant. It would be helpful if the Minister could set out, for the benefit of the committee, what guidance has been given for the use of that capacity grant, because it does sound rather like the amount that would be required to set the elections back up again at very short notice, expensive as it would be. And when we reflect on the words of one of her predecessors, when he spoke in Parliament during an urgent question, and he said that, he described himself as being blunt, but he said, local leaders across the political spectrum have worked in good faith, and I agree with him. He said they have put aside their self-interest and their differences, and they did, in his words, as a former minister of this government, everything asked of them to secure a better settlement for the people that they represent. And he concluded by saying, of this government's actions, we need to be better than this. Does this minister agree?
And I call Minister Alison McGovern.
Thank you, Mr Mundell. It is a pleasure, as ever, to serve under your chairmanship. And I would like to thank the member for Caithness, Sutherland and Easter Ross for leading this debate, and to thank all members of the House who have contributed to this important debate. I would also like to thank Mr Mundell, the more than 100,000 people who signed the petition that has brought us here today. Their engagement, as members have said, reflects the strength of feeling about local democracy, the future of local councils and the changes needed to get better public services and stronger economic growth across England. Mr Mundell, 20 years ago this year, I stood to be a local councillor, standing for election for the first time. And I remember it as a humbling and important experience. And I share the views of all members about the foundational nature of democracy. I also grew up in the Wirral, and 52 years ago, we had quite a number of councils on the Wirral, and it was Cheshire. But when I was born, we had a unitary council, and I was born in Merseyside. And now we're part of the Liverpool City region with a Metro Mayor. So I am aware of how change can affect areas personally. And I would just say to the member for Raleigh about whether or not people demand mayors. He makes a reasonable point in that most people are focused on the bread and butter. But I would only say, in my experience, with having had a mayor for some years, the people I represent have felt and seen the benefit of that. So I would just say to him, watch this space. I want to begin by acknowledging the concerns raised by petitioners and that has been expressed today, because democratic legitimacy matters profoundly. People must have confidence that their vote counts and their voice is heard. and they must have the confidence that the structures into which representatives are elected are sustainable, capable and fit to deliver the services on which communities rely. And the member for Woking and I have engaged several times in this House, and we will continue to engage about the points he rightly makes about Woking's debt and what we must do to guard against such things happening again in the future. Our responsibility is to safeguard both. In many parts of the country, residents continue to live with a two-tier system that is inefficient, confusing and poorly suited to the demands of the modern state. And that is why this government is undertaking the most ambitious programme of local government reorganisation in half a century. We're replacing outdated two-tier arrangements with simpler single-tier unitary councils that are better equipped to take decisions quickly, create economic growth and support integrated public services. And this is where I must slightly disagree with the member for Raleigh, because bringing together, for example, housing and social services under a unitary council is a different arrangement. So his characterisation of the situation of we're not moving away from two tiers because there'll still be an Essex-wide body is not quite right, because the value of a unitary council is bringing together those services that at the moment are apart. So it's not quite the situation that he's...
Just very briefly. Brady, by the way, just very briefly. We're going to have a unitary tier in the government's plans. By the way, my advice to her is cut your losses and drop the whole thing in Essex. It's a shambles. But under the government's plans, we'll have a unitary tier, but we'll then have a tier above them, which is a combined authority drawn from some of those councils and a mayor. That is patently, obviously, two tiers of local government, replacing two different tiers of local government. To pretend it's one is fantasy.
Thank you, Mr. Mandel. Let me try this again. Rayleigh. Rayleigh. I've got that right this time. Just as he says, Mr. Mandel. Let me try again. In bringing together the functions of district councils and county councils, we can integrate public services better. That we still need a strategic tier does not undermine that argument, in my opinion. And that's why I would say with one council responsible for growth, decisions can be taken faster, opportunities can be seized more confidently, and investment aligned behind a coherent long-term vision. This is not a bureaucratic exercise. As I just said to the Honourable Member for Rayleigh, when housing, public health, children's services, adult social care and planning sit within a single organisation, the public benefits. Support services can work around the whole person, not just the element of their life that happens to fall within a particular tier of government. Nearly a third of England's population live in areas where responsibility for services is split between two councils, and residents tell us they struggle to know which council is responsible for what. As I've said previously, one county council recorded more than 140,000 incidents of residents contacting the wrong authority when trying to get help. And that's not the public's failure, it's a failure of the system designed for a different era. Two-tier government is significantly more expensive than it needs to be, and across the country, taxpayers fund duplicate political and managerial structures. Two sets of councillors, two leadership teams, two finance functions, two planning departments, and often different electoral cycles, and these inefficiencies waste tens of millions of pounds each year. That money should be directed to social care, children's services, housing, and to neighbourhoods. And the petition before us today focuses on one specific aspect of this broader change programme: the powers available to ministers to make changes to the timing of local elections in areas undergoing reorganisation. And as colleagues know, the Secretary of State originally concluded, based on extensive representations from councils, that postponement would release essential capacity in 30 areas where councils set out detailed concerns about their ability to deliver complex structural change alongside running full elections. Those decisions were taken case by case, guided by evidence submitted through more than 400 representations, and reflected clear precedents for temporarily aligning electoral cycles with structural transition. However, following the receipt of further legal advice, the government has now revoked that decision. A fresh decision was taken quickly to ensure certainty for councils, candidates and voters. A revocation order was laid, and as such, all of the elections originally proposed for postponement will now proceed in May 2026. We have written to all affected councils, and the government is working closely with returning officers, administrators and suppliers to provide the practical support required to deliver those elections successfully within the timetable. Now, I just want to turn to a couple of the questions that members asked. And the member for Woking and also the Shadow Minister asked me about legal considerations that applied to previous decisions. And I would just say that those previous postponements were legal. The powers to postpone, as we know, existing in statute, and they are unchanged by the most recent decision. I also have committed to write to the Honourable Member in the previous Delegated Legislative Committee, and members who were there will remember that that response will be circulated, and it will be in the usual way. I would also just say to the Shadow Minister that he said himself about the way in which governments of all parties have handled legal advice, and I'm sure I don't need to repeat the reasons why we would treat it in that way. He knows that well, and the member for Horsham and others mentioned the circumstances of Cheltenham, which just show that there can be circumstances in which that would be used, and a number of members, and the member for Romford mentioned Margaret Thatcher extending and changing the terms of the GLC. So clearly there are circumstances in which this power needs to be used. A number of members finally asked about whether or not we would consider changing the law, and the government will engage with amendments in the usual way. We recognise, of course, the reversal of this decision places additional pressures on councils in reorganisation areas, and as has been mentioned, the Secretary of State announced last week up to 63 million in capacity funding on top of 7.6 million already provided to support councils to deliver reorganisation effectively, and we're in touch with councils directly about those resources. But let me turn briefly to the petition's central concern, the powers themselves. Parliament provided these powers for the specific context of structural reform, and previous governments have used them in comparable circumstances, as I've just mentioned and as has been said. But we fully recognise the strength of interest from members in how these powers are framed and exercised. The English Devolution and Community Empowerment Bill, now before Parliament, provides an appropriate forum for considering these issues, and as I've just mentioned, the government is considering amendments tabled and will engage with them in the usual parliamentary fashion, and I do not intend to prejudge discussions in either house. Looking ahead, the focus is now on supporting councils to run safe and effective elections in May, and on progressing reorganisation in a way that improves local services and delivers long-term value for money. The new unitary authorities that will follow will eliminate duplication, strengthen accountability, and make place planning more easy, including with housing, transport, economic development, and public services within a single strategic framework. They will also deliver significant savings, estimated at about 40 million a year in allowances and associated cost, at least 120 million over the first 3 years, which can be reinvested into frontline services. Mr. Mundell, to conclude, elections matter deeply. They matter to us all. And so does the long-term resilience of local government. And members will be aware, after the past decade and a half, I have a significant job on my hands to get all local government towards a better and more sustainable future. When the further legal advice was received, Secretary of State acted swiftly to revoke the postponement decision and confirm elections will proceed in May 2026. The government remains committed to delivering simpler, stronger councils to serve their communities. And with that, Mr. Mundell, I will conclude.
Jamie Stone to wind up, if you wish.
Mr. Mundell. As you know, Mr. Mundell, I am somewhat long in the tooth, as we say north of the border, and I was just doing a wee sum here on a little bit of paper. I have contested in my life 11 elections. And I would say that my wife and my children don't always greet the prospect of another election with huge enthusiasm. But I know what I'm talking about. And I might also say that it seems slightly surreal to me to have once upon a time, all those years ago, talking at great length in Dingwall about dog poo in some of the towns and villages of the Highlands, and to find myself here actually having introduced a debate about local government elections. It seems to me that the contributions have been very, very helpful this evening, and the Minister in her reply displays, I believe, a certain knowledge of local government, which is a comfort, because not everyone understands the whys and wherefores. I want to make two comments. The first one is that I made in my own contribution a reference to changes being referred to statutory instruments. And I would argue, but I think this is for another day, that the supervision of statutory instruments, the examination of statutory instruments, is something that we perhaps could do a little bit better in this place. But that is not for today. And the Honourable Member for Romford talked about what constituencies should not or should be called. If I wanted to be pedantic, I could insist my constituencies called Caithness, Easter Ross, Wester Ross, the Black Isle and the northern parts of Inverness, but we won't go that way. I want to thank all the people who signed the petition. I've also got to be seen to be even-handed in this debate, Mr. Mundell, as you well know. So I shall conclude with simply this, that we hold democracy as being very, very precious in this country. And when we see what is happening in other parts of the world, I think we realise even more so how important this is. But I would say simply this in conclusion, that trust in democracy is absolutely vital. If that goes, then we're in trouble. Mr. Mundell, I thank you.
The question is that this House has considered E-petition 747234 relating to the Secretary of State's power to cancel local elections. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order, order. The sitting stands adjourned.